Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Jim Shook. As Dr. Koserpour said, I'm a physics and astronomy double major and a veteran of the United States Army. I served 6 years, both in the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Thank you. Definitely not just for me, but anytime you run across a veteran, definitely tell him thank you because it means a lot. So as a science major and somebody who is completely fascinated by the world and trying to understand how it works, I'm honored to be here today to talk to you about neuroscience and as it applies to communication and specifically conflict and conflict transformation. So let's talk briefly about what neuroscience actually is. Put simply, it's the study of brain structure and function. It can almost be too simple of an explanation because really the brain is constantly amazing and stunning us with its capacities and what it actually does. So let's talk briefly about the old perspective in psychology. I'm sure many of you have heard the term tabula rasa, which refers to the idea that at birth we're all born as clean slates, and it's from the moment that we're born up until we die that the brain begins to lay down the foundations of who we are and basically, give us our personalities. Well, there's also the idea of determinism versus free will. If we are clean slates and the world imprints itself upon us to make us who we are, then are we really in control of our lives or our experiences and our reality? Or is everything predestined and do we have no control? So that perspective has changed, and now we see that the brain and its role are much more dynamic than previously thought. That it's more of a concept of determinism and free will, that there really is a duality between what is happening internally within our minds and who we are as people and flourishing and developing and learning about ourselves versus the brain taking in the environmental stimuli that we receive constantly and using that to kind of forge our, what I like to call a framework that is the brain that is going to be how our personalities are expressed. So how does this relate to us in terms of a way that we can understand easily? Basically, the brain is the middleman between our genes and the world, and I'd like to briefly expand upon that, if possible. Our genes are basically the blueprints of who we are as species on this planet, and it applies to all animals, and it's basically required in order for life to be possible. It has all the instructions for every single cell that's in your body. And this DNA is constantly being expressed, and involved in that, obviously, is the development of the brain. And I like to use the analogy that you can look at the brain sort of as a house, but it's more dynamic than that. Perhaps at birth, we are born with a foundation laid that our house can be built upon, but really the brain is also the foreman and the construction crew and the tools, the engineers, the architect, and it's constantly revising the plan of the house. It's constantly evaluating what it is that's happening to us and saying, how do I take this information and translate it into a way where I'm going to get a finished home for my consciousness, if you want to call it the family within the house. And, obviously it's very important to take away the idea that the brain is taking cues from the environment and constantly throughout our lives on the fly is adjusting the plan of the house. So here's the brain, and for all you students who are expecting to get extra credit, you're going to have to fill out a blank one of these before you can get it. So the brain is compartmentalized with different regions responsible for different functions, and it's kind of amazing how far it's broken down into all the little things that you wouldn't think might necessarily have their own part in the brain that's controlling it, but it does, and it's very resilient. It's capable of adapting to instances of trauma. So if you have certain centers of the brain that are controlling certain aspects of movement that becomes damaged and can no longer function, other parts of the brain can, in some instances, take over for the damaged part and kind of allow you to adjust to that. Let's move forward. Here's more talking briefly about genes. This is something I think everybody's seen here. It's a DNA molecule. But it really doesn't do the DNA molecule justice, because in real life, in the cells that are in your body, it's sort of this pool of spaghetti that lives in the nucleus of your cell, and your cell is always constantly trying to translate it. It's a process called gene expression, and it's always happening unless the cell is dividing or something like this. But the point is, in order for your body to be sustained, DNA is always being read. And it's certain parts for certain cells, and that's why you have liver cells and eye cells and skin cells, because within each cell, although the same DNA is in every single cell, because of where it's at in the body and because of the signals being sent to it by the brain, it has different parts of its DNA available for translation by what's called conscription factors, which is basically just proteins that allow for the DNA to be read. So, as I said, gene expression is continuous, and it is really dependent on the signals that your brain is sending to those cells in order for them to be expressed. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that as the brain takes in signals or stimuli from the environment and translates it in a way that allows us to function, it can basically, the brain can influence how those genes are expressed, for better or for worse. So what does that mean to me right now? Well, it means that my initial framework is modified throughout life as a result of experience. The opinions, habits, hopes, fears, i.e. the things that make me me, is a result of how my brain has learned to relate the outside stimuli to my genes. So I thought this was a really effective quote from one of the research articles we read in class, from the abstract of the article, that kind of lays down how I want to relate this to conflict and transformation. Aggression and violent behavior are set in motion by the earliest experiences between the infant and the caretaker and reinforced by the individual's environment. And what the article is specifically saying is that, from the moment you're born, you're not a blank slate. You have the tools necessary to basically grow and develop, and what that means for an infant is being able to recognize your mother's voice, being able to recognize faces, being able to mimic expressions, facial expressions that an infant sees on a person. Those behaviors don't pop up out of nowhere. They're specifically programmed within our genes, and those genes are being expressed when the infant does those gestures or makes those recognitions. And as it relates to conflict, the important thing about that to take away is that if a child is constantly developing their mind and that physical development impacts who they are as a person, then the environment that you grow up in is extremely important. So areas where a child might be exposed to high levels of stress, such as poverty or violence, war, things like that, or neglect from a parent, those can be manifested in a physical form in the brain, because as we are receiving stimuli, the brain is constantly talking not only to itself but to the rest of the body and saying, how do I make sense of all this? And if it's only negative stimuli that it's receiving, it's basically, to go back to the example of the house, it's taking that, if you want to call aggression a room in the house, it's saying, okay, this room is really important, so we need to revise the blueprint and make this room bigger, put more lights in it, so on and so forth. It's saying that because stress is so prevalent in what I'm experiencing, I want to wire myself in a way that is conducive to that, and obviously not beneficial, but certainly it's responding to the stimulus that it receives. So why does that matter to a conflict? Well, we're all embedded in conflicts, whether it be as an outside intermediary or the conflicts within our life. So who we are is vital to the evolution of a conflict. You have to understand that you can't separate yourself from the conflict. It's just not possible. Our personality, to an extent, is dependent on our genetics. Then understanding who we are is vital to conflict transformation. Disagreements are not simply a refusal to cooperate, and that's important. And that might sound obvious, but it's important to realize that there's actual physical, empirical evidence that supports that in our real world. It's not just this idea of consciousness being this abstract thing that's affected by what happens. There's physicality to it. So I like to use the analogy of a mountain to describe conflict transformation. There certainly can be big and look intimidating, and they're difficult to climb and surpass, and but nobody ever gets mad at the mountain for being hard to climb, you know? We don't get mad, or we might get mad that it's always steep or there's never any downhill, but we don't take it out on the mountain. And you know what? It's extremely rewarding when we do get to the top. And you know, anything worth doing is worth doing right, and it's going to be difficult to do. And that's really the important thing about conflict transformation, is that it curbs the idea of quick and easy solutions. And although those can be available at times, that is not the norm, and that's not the way that it should be gone.